Okay, I think you're back on, and the last thing that was caught before the stream was broken was Representative Ansell asking Mr. Beck to call out the page number. So I don't think we got the narrative portion of the changes.
Okay, so I apologize, Mr. Beck, but I think we should go back for the interest of transparency and public information to go over the narrative that we just talked about. If you could, you can go through it fairly quickly, and then we can get to, which I think will be really important to people, is looking at the layout and the map and asking questions. So my apologies, but I think it's good if we go back. Thank you.
Sure. So we're in section 3 of the report. Excuse me, on page 20, 21. And to reiterate, the medium term focus is that 8-month plan to January of 2022, and the long-term plan, which is what you can accomplish in 3 to 10 years. So there's really 2 reports within this one report. So we'll start with the medium-term recommendations. On page 21 is the list of questions that we were discussing, something good to review for your team to look at. And then what can you physically accomplish in the 8-month period? So this is the narrative form along with pros and cons for each, both the medium term and the long term. But for the medium term, we present 2 options. And so the 2 options for the medium term, what can you do in 8 months, is to return the legislators and the staff to the State House, and all public, press, and witnesses have access via Zoom, and improvements to the IT infrastructure. Now, these are recommendations that our firm is bringing after the interviews and analyzing the building through the prior 2 reports. Pre-pandemic report, we did a state assessment report, which had identified space pressures and deficiencies. And then we did a second report on returning during the pandemic, on how that could be made possible. And this is our 3rd report and recommendation. So the option B is to return everyone into the State House, but for public access, we provide larger spaces in 133 State Street and 109 State. And the pros and cons are in narrative form on page 24. So to show the physical changes, we have graphic diagrams, graphic floor plans illustrating the medium return plan in option A. So you'll see on page 25 a color diagram which highlights and lists the physical changes that you can accomplish in the next 8 months. So this is the first floor. I don't think I'll go into this in a lot of detail. But it's primarily taking larger spaces, turning them into committee rooms, hearing rooms, taking a couple of walls down in the House committee areas to enlarge those committees. In the back of the report, the appendix is important because we highlight what the ideal committee size rooms should be and what goes on within them for occupancy. And this is the adding on to option A, option B, which is enlarging the geographical area for public, meaning 133 State Street and 109 State. Some of those rooms were set up during the pandemic as we did our report and suggested that these spaces would be large enough to have committees, hearings, and public. So these are some illustrations of where those are located and what some of the rooms are, how they're set up right now. Along with this is the medium-term renovation cost estimate. So it follows the list of physical changes with a cost of construction and a total project cost, as well as adding on option B. The other thing that you'll see on page 31 following the project cost estimate for both options is a timeline. So it's a month-by-month timeline on how those physical changes can be achieved. And it's a rather fast timeline, but we believe it's doable. So we're going to switch now to the second large component of the report, which is the long-term recommendations. It really evolves into a master planning approach of how you can achieve the space that we believe you will need over the next 30 years. So this is a 3 to 10 year investment to make changes, add on to the building, accommodate what we have seen over the last 5 years of pressures on the building, and reading backwards towards other reports that have done through probably the last 20 years on some of the master planning that's taken place. What we've done is we've broken this down, master plan, into components, individual components. So on page 33 or page 32, we start listing each components in narrative form. And this will be followed again with colored diagrams identifying these components. And I think it'll be easier to see in diagram form. So there on page 35, you'll see a colored diagram listing these components. Not that they're in any order, because that's I'm a creative, so they bounce around in numbers. So they're not like number one is not the highest priority. It's just a way of numbering the components. So on the diagram in brown, in the center is an overbuild of the existing cafeteria. The building was structured to go up. We have not brought an engineer to verify that, but that is a likely suspect to go up. Next over in bluish is component 2. We're calling that, nicknaming that the public house. That is a 3-story addition linked back to the State House. This is on the west side of the State House, in between 1 Baldwin Street, or affectionately known as the Pink Lady. And this is really the new access entry point that will give the public multiple levels of direct access in a controlled manner and access back into the State House via the connections to the cafeteria and the House chambers. Component 3 is to provide a functioning loading dock. Currently, the loading dock is via the parking area and poses a lot of physical problems. So we are segregating that and providing an independent loading dock and recreating the parking areas to the west of the Pink Lady. The Pink Lady itself in the future could link back through component 5 to attach to the public house. And on the east side, there's an addition, component 4, which would also provide a secure entrance from the east side and the parking areas towards Court Street. And that is another 3-story addition. There's a couple of components that aren't physically shown, which are extremely important. Component 6 is technology. All of these components will require technology. And component 7 is mechanical, electrical, plumbing systems, which is an ongoing need. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And of course, when you do additions, you then can decant certain spaces within the State House. We call that backfill renovations. So it provides an opportunity to get into larger committee rooms, and all of a sudden those small rooms can open up for another use. So in the next series of pages are the floor plans that go with those components, so you can see how all the spaces work together. They're color coded with a space use key on the lower right. So you can go back and forth and identify the new spaces and the backfill renovated spaces and how they're used once you build an addition. And there's a space use chart with square footages on the left. So we're on pages 36 and 37 and 38. So in summary, the additions provide public spaces. They provide larger committee rooms and hearing rooms, provides more dining, intermingling space, creates more office areas. The backfill renovations provide the ability for staff to have a little bit more space instead of working on top of each other. It relieves the pressure that so many people occupying this building. It gives them space to breathe, walk around, intermingle, and lets the history of the State House be less encumbered and more free-flowing. Preserves the history. A glimpse of what this might look like from the front lawn. You can see the addition between the One Baldwin Street and the Capitol. We just chose sort of a light front glass look to not try to mimic the history of the Capitol. So along with this is both a cost estimate and a timeline. And I think that the major point here is that these components can be achieved one at a time, or in groups, or all at once, or over time. Some of the components are intermingled. So say you want to overbuild the cafeteria. Well, there's some mechanical MEP components in component 7 that you would have to achieve. Component 8 is actually an allowance for asbestos abatement if we find that, which we have not done a complete study in this 5-week period for some of these issues. But it's a way to look at this in components, add up costs, and I'd be happy to work with you because I'm sure there's plenty of questions regarding this. So the timeline is something that has to be developed further, but it shows you a duration for design, permitting, and legislative approvals of about a 2-year timeline. And then depending on which components and how much you're biting off, there's a construction phasing schedule below. I just chose 3 phases so that you can see the durations that some of these components may take, which is about an 18-month construction phase. So there's a lot in that master plan to digest. There's a lot of choices, and we can come back to that. In the appendix, you'll see the written study directive, the list of interview questions on page 45. We tallied the programmatic space use within the building by areas. I mentioned codes and life safety. This is a recommendation that we're making to take place as soon as possible, is to hire a code consultant. We have a list of code consultants that we've worked nationally that can come in and identify space use, life safety, occupancy levels, and determine any code deficiencies within the building. I mentioned earlier that our space planning and our master planning and our recommendations are based upon occupancy levels. And this illustrates our recommendations for any future committee rooms, hearing rooms, their sizes, and the appropriate number of people, and how through our interviews people would like to use these spaces for the support of those committees, whether it be legal or staff, committee chairs. This is all illustrated within these diagrams. And then lastly, everybody loves to talk about parking and walking in and out of the Capitol. We did a report quite a while ago showing the ability to have a parking structure on Court Street, but this is just to refresh everybody's memories that parking can be achieved within a very short walk to the Capitol. So that's really a quick walkthrough of the report. And I wanted to come back to the executive summary, where I think you all will have a lot of questions about the medium-term return, both options A and B, and also the long term. So why don't I just stop there and open it up for questions?
If I could, yes, thank you, Mr. Beck. Really appreciate it. And for folks who had been watching the live stream, we were aware that we lost connection. So I had Mr. Beck go back and reiterate what he had said earlier. The one thing that was not captured was that during the time when we were not live, I made it really explicit that these are recommendations coming from Friedman, French, and Friedman about how we can be thinking about the space going forward within the Capitol complex. These are recommendations. This is not a plan. We ask them to look carefully at our options. The work of figuring out what options we might take is the work of this committee, as well as committees of jurisdiction within the building. So I want to say a couple things before I open it up to discussion. One, we asked for this information, and it's capturing a point in time, where we are right now, where the conditions are on the ground right now as it relates to the pandemic. They're giving us a snapshot of options. As a historian myself, I know that when I hear words like knocking down a wall, for example, I know I have a visceral reaction to that. I don't know if any of you also may feel that way. I'm a historian, my sister's an art historian. We talk a lot about historic homes. And so I understand this is a workplace in the State House. It's also a historic building. It's a museum, as it were, that we all work in. So of course, we would not take any of these decisions lightly. Other thing I want to say is we're going to have many eyes and minds on what this will look like going into January, and of course, long-term planning. And prior to us coming back this year, as it unfolded, it became clear we weren't going to be working in the building, but the previous speaker did pull together various stakeholder groups to talk about how the building can interact with the public going forward. So I know that in speaking with the current speaker, Speaker Korinsky, and I have talked about pulling together some more subgroups made up of the press, advocacy groups, citizens, and how they would like to see the building functioning going forward. The plan that will evolve is going to evolve over months and years. This is really a visioning process here of what we want the space to be going forward. We want to have a safe, accessible workplace and keep the building in some way open to the public. We are committed to that. We're just not quite sure at this point, given where the pandemic is, what shape that will take. So at this point, I'd love to open it up to questions and comments, and just make clear to everyone on this committee, this is the beginning of a very long, in-depth conversation about what our workspace will look like going forward. So Mr. Beck, if you don't mind taking the screen sharing down so that I can see all the members of the committee. And I want to say, because we lost a little bit of time when we lost the live stream, and we do have a second item on the agenda, again, this is the beginning of this process. So don't feel like this is going to be the only time we'll be talking about this. So I see Senator Benning, and then on deck, Representative Ansel.
So Jesse, love to have you come back into our committee and talk about this. But in the meantime, if I can also get Mike Farrant to respond, I would love to be able to have a copy of this report sent via mail, a hard copy to each of my committee members, keeping in mind this is just a piece of a major discussion. But in order to get the committee members involved in the beginning of that discussion, I was wondering if, Michael, you can get this sent out to us overnight mail.
Yes, we can absolutely get with Tony in the copy room and have hard copies sent out to everyone on the Senate Institutions Committee. Is that the one you're referring to?
Yes, it is. And
okay,
I don't know whether Representative Emmons wants a similar copy delivered to her.
I see her nodding.
Yes, please, that would be helpful.
We'll have one sent out to House Corrections and Institutions as well. Joint Ledge Management Committee members as well.
Yes, please.
Okay, we'll do.
Anything else, Senator Benning, before I move on? Thank you. Representative Ansel.
So this is a timing question. I appreciate the your reminding everybody that this is a long-term process and we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about it and taking information in and hearing from people and all the things that we need to do for the long-term plan. But on the medium-term plan, which is looking to January, I wonder if somebody can tell us what are the short-term decisions that we need to make and when do we need to make them? Because it looks to me like those have to happen quickly, and that is going to be challenging in a lot of ways. But we might as well know what the timeline is.
It's a great question, Representative Ansel, and one I know that the speaker and I have been noodling over. I think it's not entirely clear to us what all those decision points are and what the timeline should be. I'm really going to be looking to the Sergeant of Arms in conjunction with both the chairs of the committees of jurisdiction for us to help us figure out what those decision points are. I also know, if I could, Senator Kitchell, if you would just remind the committee of the amount of money that is in the budget related to preparing for implementing some or as we prepare in getting ourselves ready for January, looking at the recommendations from the report. What is the line item in the budget?
My memory is it's 2.8 million, and it's recognizing there's additional cost, fee for space, as well as IT investments that have to be made. So that's the amount we have put in the budget.
And Representative Ansel, the speaker and I have also talked along with Arlene Donovan, our incoming HR, that we're going to probably have to have some subgroups working on specific topics. And certainly this one is one of the most immediate topics. So looking at a subgroup within Jlmc and pulling in other people from the committees of jurisdiction to help inform our work. And so I think that's something, and I'm looking at the speaker and she's nodding, I think that's something that we need to get in place before we pass the budget so that we know what's happening over the summer and fall to get the subgroup in place is what I'm saying, not a plan, but to get a subgroup in place that is going to be looking at those issues. So, and I welcome input from this entire group about what those decision points should be. I think
if I could add on
sure.
page 21, there's a good list of questions to start. It's a good place.
Great,
to start.
thank you. Thank you for that reminder. Senator Benning. Sorry. Let me go back to, Representative Ansel, follow up.
I thought I saw somewhere in here a timeline for the January decisions, but maybe it's somewhere. But it struck me that it needs to start soon, like
Yes, like yesterday.
April.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, indeed.
All right. Thank you.
So do you have that page number, Mr. Beck?
The timeline?
Yes.
Yes, let me get it for you. It is on page 31 for
Thank
the
you.
medium term.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Benning.
So, Becca, I'm hoping that you and the speaker are starting to focus on what the parameters of this committee actually involve. I'm not clear as I sit here whether or not it would be this committee or joint rules that would be making decisions about how and when to go forward. There are a couple of immediate concerns. BGS would very much like to move into the 5th floor at 133 State Street. That conversation has to be had with somebody. The 2 institutions committees chairs have talked about it with BGS, but we're trying to focus on how do we make the next step legislatively to make something like that come to fruition. The other problem we have in the Senate immediately is Bobby Starr needs a committee room. And as I understand it, there's a boiler system that's going to be replaced where the current legislative council offices are. And there's a possibility of putting a committee room in part of that space. We'd like to be able to figure out who is ultimately going to make that call to go forward, whether it's this committee or rules. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Benning. Yes, you are speaking my mind, which is that we have to get clear on jurisdiction. As you said, do some of these decisions rest with joint rules? Do they rest with this committee? And so I'm going to be looking to our attorneys to help us figure that out. And my hope is that in the next week and a half, the speaker and I can sit down with Senator Benning and the chair of Institutions and Corrections on the House side, Representative Emmons, who's not a member of this committee, but certainly needs to be part of this conversation. So be looking for an invite to that conversation. Thank you. Other comments, questions? Senator Mazza.
The funding part, I think that's going to be a key issue of how it's paid for. And I think we have to do a good job in selling that because, you know, the first reaction will be from the public, why are you spending all this money for, you know, different things? So I think that's a key when you're talking about this kind of expansion. How is it funded in the future?
Absolutely. Absolutely, Senator. And that is, I think, the tricky situation we are in as a citizen legislature and having, you know, as part of our charge to keep the People's House open and all of us committed to that and trying to figure out how to do that safely long term. So absolutely, the funding piece is critical here. Representative Colston.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To build off of Senator Mazza's point, I think we have an opportunity to market this as a solution. It's an access solution. We're improving it. We're making it more safe and accessible. So I think if we approach it in that way, I think Vermonters will embrace it.
Thank you, Representative Colston. And that is our hope for whatever plan we put in place, that we'll feel like we have the support of the public. So at this point, I know there's a lot to say and noodle over around this report. We do have another important agenda item. So I will just say, if there is feedback that you have as you have a little bit more time to dig into the report, please get that feedback to me and to the speaker so that we can loop in the chairs of both committees of jurisdiction. Thank you so much, Jesse Beck, for your work and for your team's work. I see Jane Pickell is also on the call. I don't know if there are other people from your team on the call that you want to highlight before we pivot.
Just the two of us.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So the next item of business is the Capitol Police body camera policy, and Chief Romei is joining us this morning. And so just to review for folks, we had tasked the chief with coming back to Jlmc with a body camera policy by a particular date. And I just want to be clear, and I said this to the chief and to the sergeant of arms, they were completely and totally on task, and they met all their deadlines. And it was actually our committee that slowed the process down a little bit. So I just want to publicly acknowledge that they did everything that we asked them to do. If you recall, in the last meeting, as we were supposed to vote on the body camera policy, there was some hesitation among the part of the committee members feeling like we didn't necessarily have the expertise to be weighing in on this. So the speaker and I engaged with committees of jurisdiction in each of our chambers, and it was clear that there is obviously a national conversation happening around policing and body cameras. There is also quite a bit of conversation happening within the state about body camera policies generally. And so in speaking with the chairs of government operations and judiciary within the Senate, getting their sense of where we're at, it seemed to make the most sense to go back to the chief. I sat down with the chief and the sergeant of arms last week, who went over with me the body camera policy. I think we've landed on a good place. Our hope is that the chief will give his presentation, that we will be able to vote in support of the recommended policy. And I will explain if there are any more pieces before we vote. But I think if I hand it over to the chief and he takes us through how we landed on the policy we now have, I think that will give everyone a lot of comfort. So Chief Romei, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Senator. Can everyone hear me okay at this point?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Just for the record, Matthew Romei, Chief of Police, and I will tell you that I have lost everyone's video. So if you're waving hysterically at me, I can't see you. So you'll have to call out audibly. So in response to our meeting last week, I have submitted I guess revision 2 of a draft policy to the committee that, with one exception, is substantially consistent with the model body cam policy in place with the from the Law Enforcement Advisory Board. And just to hey Mike, I need host status again so I can share a screen. While Mike's working on that, so in 2016, the Law Enforcement Advisory Board, in response to the legislature's 2016 Action Resolves number 163, developed a body camera policy, model body camera policy for the state. In last year's, okay, here we go. I have screen sharing. This is just the memorandum that I submitted to you. In this current year's budget, in the fiscal year 21 budget, the language in section E128 identifies that the appropriation to the Sergeant at Arms office for the Capitol Police to obtain body cameras is on hold until the Joint Legislative Management Committee reviews and adopts a final body camera policy. Also in 2020, the General Assembly adopted, passed Act 166, which amended 20 VSA to outline that every law enforcement agency in the state that authorizes its officers to use body camera policies shall adopt, follow, and enforce a model body camera policy established by the Vermont Criminal Justice Training Council, or Vermont Criminal Justice Council now is the name, and that everyone has to comply with the provisions of that policy. Until that happens, the policy passed by the Law Enforcement Advisory Board pursuant to 2016 Action Resolves 163 is in force. So the model policy, or the policy that you have in front of you now for consideration, is based on that Law Enforcement Advisory Board policy, which was updated slightly in February. And the differences between the draft policy you see and the model policy, where you see things like chief executive officer in the model policy, we've substituted chief of police. There are some numbering corrections and some grammar corrections within this policy. It substitutes the name of the department for this agency, the things that you would expect to see in taking a model policy and adapting it for a specific department. The substantive change is in the records, recording, storage, and documentation. And one day I'll figure out why this is, but there's a standing thought that the state archivist does not control legislative activities, I guess is the best way for me to explain how I understand it. So in this section, we took out the requirement that the state archivist authorize the records retention schedule, and we substituted a records retention schedule that we tactically acquired from another law enforcement agency in the state that has this in place already with a blessing from the state archivist. There is a line in here that assumes that this may change, that best practices do change from time to time, and that the Sergeant at Arms and I can consult with Legislative Counsel, with our Public Records Act attorneys, and update these to meet those best practice standards without coming back for a full review of the policy. That is the substantive difference between the model policy and the draft policy you have in front of you. I'm happy to answer specific or general questions regarding this. I think that it's a great place to start. I will say that this, like every law enforcement policy, will have a procedure that goes along with it to implement it. And they're living documents. They do change from time to time with court cases and statutes that the General Assembly updates or modifies, and we'll continue to be responsive to those as they come.
Thank you, Chief. And so just to make it explicit for people who are joining this conversation sort of midstream, currently our police department here within the Capitol complex does not have body cameras that they are using. Is that correct? Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes, ma'am, that is correct.
So there has been concern on the part of the chief and his officers, as well as the Sergeant of Arms and the public, that it is an uncomfortable position for our police to be in, to not be using body cameras when so many of our law enforcement agencies across Vermont are already implementing the use of these devices. So, questions for the chief? Comments? So I really want to thank the chief and the Sergeant of Arms for taking the time with me last week to go through this policy piece by piece. I really appreciate the due diligence that you did and in addressing some of my concerns, and I really appreciate the care that you've put into the proposal before the committee today. So I'm looking for a motion to adopt the Capitol Police body camera policy that the chief has brought forward today.
I'll make that motion, Madam.
Thank you, Representative Leclerc. Do I need a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Senator Kitchell. Are there any questions or comments before I call the roll on this motion? So all those in favor of adopting the Capitol Police body camera policy as introduced by question.
I think we probably should do an actual roll call on this.
Yes, Yes, thank you.
Oh, I thought you were
I-
asking for, yeah.
Yes, thank you, Representative Anderson. No, I will call the roll. Thank you. It's always good to make it explicit. So I will now call the roll. I will start with Senator Mazza,
Yes.
Senator Benning,
Yes.
Senator Kitchell,
Yes.
Representative Colston,
Yes.
Representative Leclerc,
Yes.
Representative Karinsky,
Yes.
and Senator Ballant. I also vote in support. Hopefully I did not forget anyone. So
Got me.
Representative Ansel, how could I? Thank you. The vote is,
Made a vote or,
what's that? Yes,
Did you
you're going to
want me
vote
to
yes?
vote?
Yes, yes,
Yes.
please, Representative Ansel. Okay. The vote is 8-0 in support of adopting this policy. And so thank you so much, Chief. And as we get more instructions on how the state model policy might change, you know, the chief will come before us again for any of those updates. So at this point, Chief, again, I want to thank you for your work, and you can now order the body cameras and start to implement the policy. So I appreciate your patience. I know it's been a long haul. So thank you very much.
I appreciate the committee.
And with that, I will gavel us out. This meeting will now be called to end.